The day the Bloodfang landed on Kessel 7, I was 40 meters underground fixing a coupling seal on a thermal exchange rig that had no business still running as well as it did. That's the thing about colonial infrastructure. Nobody designs it to last, and the people who maintain it figure out ways to make it last anyway. That's not heroism. That's just what happens when there's no one to send a requisition to, and the alternative is freezing in the dark. I heard the vibration before I heard anything else. Not the deep geological kind you learn to ignore on a mining colony, the kind that comes up through your boots like the planet breathing, but something percussive and rhythmic. Something that didn't belong to the rock. 3 thumps, each separated by a half second. Pause. 5 thumps. Pause. The pattern repeated, and I tilted my head in the dark of that access tunnel the way a dog tilts its head when it hears something, and my wrench stopped moving and I listened. 3 thumps, 5 thumps. I set down the wrench. I climbed out of the coupling shaft. I emerged into a maintenance corridor lit by the amber safety lights we used during power conservation cycles, and I stood there for a moment breathing recycled air and thinking about what I'd heard, and then I climbed the access ladder to the surface. I came up into a sky that was the wrong color. 7 shapes hung in the lower atmosphere above Kessel 7, and they were the wrong shape too, the way a shadow is the wrong shape when it doesn't match the thing casting it. Too angular, too deliberate, too still. They blocked the primary star at their edges, so that light rimmed them in gold that had no business being beautiful. And they were enormous, each one larger than the colony's main dome, drifting at an altitude that should have been empty and was not. The colony was burning in 2 places. I could see the smoke from where I stood at the maintenance shaft exit, 1 column from the direction of the comm relay station, 1 from somewhere near the eastern cargo depot. People were running along the ridge trail that led from the residential modules toward the central emergency shelter, and they were running the way people run when they are genuinely frightened, which is different from the way people run for exercise or from embarrassment. The difference is visible from a distance. I noticed it the way you notice structural differences in machinery. 1 kind of movement is controlled, the other is reactive. I stood at the top of the maintenance shaft for 3 full seconds doing nothing, which I have thought about many times since. 3 seconds of pure, stupid observation while my brain finished its survey before accepting what the survey meant. Then I ran. I didn't make it to the shelter. I don't remember exactly how they took me. I remember sound more than anything else, a deep harmonic resonance, not quite a weapon sound, more like a very large tuning fork, and then something closed around me that wasn't quite solid and wasn't quite field and wasn't anything I had a word for. The ground rotated. I hit something that wasn't the ground. Then I was somewhere else, and it was darker, and the air tasted different. I woke up in a metal room. It smelled like iron and something organic I couldn't immediately name. The floor was bare metal, cold against my back, and the ceiling was about 4 meters up, and the walls had no seams I could see, either one piece of something I wasn't familiar with, or joined so precisely that the joint was invisible, and either way it told me something about who'd made it. The light came from a strip along the ceiling edge, indirect and the color of old copper. There were 6 other people in the room with me. I knew 3 of them. Petra Solis, who ran the atmospheric processor station at the colony's north end. Dak Morrow, who handled equipment certification on the mining rigs. A woman I knew only as Yell, who did something in colony administration that I'd never had occasion to ask about. The other 3 were faces I recognized from colony common spaces but couldn't name. None of us said anything for a while. We were all doing the same thing, which was checking ourselves for damage and listening to the sounds of wherever we were. This is what reasonable people do in unfamiliar situations. They inventory what they have and assess what they can hear. We had our clothes. We had no tools, which I noticed the way an amputee notices a missing limb. What we could hear, a deep, sustained vibration that was definitely mechanical, a rhythmic subsonic pulse that I felt in my molars more than I heard it, and very occasionally something that sounded like machinery engaging at a distance. Petra Solis broke the silence first. She said, very quietly, looking at the ceiling, "The ventilation in here is running at about 40% efficiency." She said it the way a person says something technical when they need to say something true to remind themselves that they're still the person they were before whatever just happened. I understood exactly why she'd said it. 60% humidity, I said, higher than we'd be comfortable with long term. But they're comfortable with it, she said. Yes. That was the first thing I understood about the Bloodfang from proximity. They needed moisture. Everything in that room was built for beings that wanted air thicker with water vapor than any human I'd met would find comfortable. The walls were slightly damp to the touch. The metal had a surface condensation that told me the temperature differential between the air and the structure was set deliberately. I filed it away without knowing why I was filing it. A man who fixes systems catalogs everything. You never know which detail becomes the solution. They kept us for 3 days. They fed us something that arrived through a hatch in the floor at irregular intervals, pressed, roughly rectangular, not quite solid, not quite liquid, the color of old mustard. It was not food in any sense I was accustomed to, but it wasn't poison either. I ate it. The others ate it with varying degrees of visible reluctance. I'd been in enough remote postings to know that being particular about what you eat when you're being kept somewhere is a luxury you trade away the moment survival becomes the primary consideration. The guards came 4 times that I counted, twice to deliver the food, once to verify something about the room's systems that they checked from a panel near the door and departed without acknowledging us, and once to remove Dak Morrow, who did not come back. I don't know what happened to Dak. I've thought about it. I've chosen to believe the most benign explanation available. The guards were enormous. The shortest one I saw stood about 2¼ meters, built with the dense, compressed musculature of a species that had evolved for sustained physical conflict. Their skin, dark green-gray, the color of deep water over slate, was plated at the shoulders and along the jaw and forearm in keratinous armor that had grown from their own biology. It was the color of old bone and had the surface texture of layered shale. They moved with the efficient economy of people who had done this particular task many times and had stopped finding it interesting. That was the most frightening thing. Not the size, not the weapons they carried at their hips, not the alien quality of their faces. The boredom, the absolute professional disengagement. They had done this before, many times, and we were not exceptional to them in any way, and that meant there were many others who had also been unremarkable to them. On the 4th day, they separated me from the group. A guard whose shoulder armor was etched with a geometric pattern I'd been studying. I decided it was rank notation, based on how the pattern varied between different individuals, gestured me to stand. I stood. They bound my wrists in something that felt like rope and flexed like silicone and held like steel, and brought me through corridors that I was trying to memorize even as I walked them. The ship was large. That was what struck me most clearly as I was walked through it, not the alien aesthetics of the design, which were considerable, but the sheer scale. The corridors were built for beings considerably larger than me, which meant I was moving through spaces that felt almost architectural rather than vehicular. The ceilings were high. The doors were wide. Everything was made to accommodate bodies that needed more room than mine. The air changed as we went deeper into the ship. The iron smell gave way to that organic scent I'd been trying to name since I woke up in that room. I finally got it, standing in a corridor junction waiting for a door to cycle. Wet stone. The inside of a cave near a running stream. Something geological and alive at the same time. The command space was large enough to be disorienting. Screens along the walls displayed information I couldn't read. Bloodfang script, if that's the right word for it, was angular and dense, more architectural than calligraphic, built from shapes that looked like structural components rather than letters. Workstations occupied by Bloodfang officers who were, as far as I could determine, either ignoring me or cataloging me, and I genuinely could not tell which. A central platform, raised, circular, with the function and feel of a decision space. At the far end of the room was a throne. And on the throne was the queen. I didn't know she was the queen yet. I knew she was different from the moment I saw her, the way you know a structure is load-bearing before you understand the engineering reasons for it. The other Bloodfang I'd seen were built like defensive walls, mass and solidity as a first principle. She was built like a drawn bow, tension held in reserve, potential energy suspended, everything pointing toward eventual release when the conditions were right. Her shoulder armor was the deepest black I'd ever seen on a living organism, not the absorptive black of a painted surface, but the structural black of something that had shed light as a function of its existence. It didn't sit on her the way the others' armor sat on them. It looked as though it had grown into her over years, or she into it, the two things no longer distinguishable. She had tusks, shorter than the males I'd seen, curved slightly inward at the tip rather than outward, which gave her face an expression of contained force rather than open threat. Her eyes were amber, not the pale gray-green of the guards. Amber like fossilized resin, like something old that had kept its warmth. And they were watching me with the specific quality of attention that I associated with people who were actually listening rather than waiting for their turn to respond. She said something in Bloodfang. It was a language of low tones and consonants that landed in the chest more than the ear, less like speech and more like resonance, like the sound a large structure makes when something strikes it precisely. A translator device sat on the table beside her, small, hexagonal, the design I recognized from trade route briefings, and it emitted a flat mechanical voice after a moment's processing. "You are a repair technician." Not a question. "Mechanical systems," I said. "Thermal exchange, pressure coupling, atmospheric equipment, some structural." She looked at me. "You are not afraid." I considered this. "I'm afraid," I said. "I'm also more interested right now than I am afraid." Something moved across her face. Not a smile. I would learn later that Bloodfang expressing approval looked nothing like what I'd expect. A slight lowering of the secondary eyelid rather than any change in the mouth, but something in the category of recalibration, a data point being filed. She said something else. "There is a problem on this ship, you will look at it." They brought me to the engineering section. The problem was magnificent, in the specific way that a major structural failure is magnificent to the person who understands what they're looking at. The primary power relay, the system that drew energy from the ship's core and distributed it across 17 discrete subsystems, had suffered what I would describe to any engineer as a harmonic resonance cascade. The practical version: someone had pushed significantly more power through a conduit than it was rated for, and the conduit had been vibrating at a frequency that amplified the stress rather than dampening it. And over time, this had cracked 3 of the primary junction points in a pattern that was going to get worse, not better. And the failure mode at the end of the line was the environmental control system for the entire ship. The Bloodfang engineers standing around it looked at me with the expression I knew from every engineering situation I'd ever been in. People who know the thing is broken, have applied everything they know, and have exhausted their available solutions. They were not unintelligent. They were operating from a different knowledge base, and the problem had moved outside the boundaries of that knowledge base, and now they were waiting. I crouched down next to the primary junction. Cracks tell you things. The pattern of a fracture is a record of the forces that created it: direction, magnitude, timing. If you can read the crack, you can understand what made it, and if you understand what made it, you can understand what will fix it. "What's the power draw on your environmental system?" I asked. The translator device one of the engineers had picked up and was holding toward me relayed the answer: roughly 400 human standard kilowatts equivalent, and your conduit material, fixed resonance tolerance or variable. Long consultation, long answer. Fixed, the translator gave me finally. I stood. There's your problem, I said. You can't push a variable load system through a fixed tolerance conduit without a dampener array to manage the variance. You never had one, or you had one and someone bypassed it. The engineers looked at each other. The translator gave me fragments. A battle, approximately a year ago. A decision to route more power to weapons systems during an engagement. A bypass installed as a temporary measure that had become a permanent one because temporary measures always do when no one's prioritizing the repair. All right, I said. So you've been running on borrowed time since then and the debt just came due. I told them what I needed. They brought materials slowly, with the skepticism of people who have been promised solutions before and learned to wait for evidence. I spent 6 hours on the deck of an alien warship doing something that felt, in its core, like every repair I'd ever made. Find the fault, understand the fault, work around the fault using what you have available. The work doesn't care whose ship it is. The physics is the same. When the relay came back online, the hum in the engineering section changed register, from the slightly strained frequency of a system working harder than it should to the even, lower tone of a system running where it's supposed to run. The flicker that had been in the overhead lights for what I suspected was months disappeared. The engineers were quiet for a moment, listening. One of them said something that the translator caught only partially, but the word it rendered was balance. They brought me back to the command room. The Queen was standing at a viewscreen station when I entered, not at the throne. She didn't turn. It is working, the translator said. For now, I said. You need a proper dampener array installed within 60 days, or the fix will begin to stress the conduit walls, and you'll have the same problem again. She turned then, looked at me with those amber eyes for a moment that lasted longer than it needed to. Why did you tell me that? The translator said. I thought about it. Because it's true, I said, and because a fix that fails in 2 months isn't a fix. It's a delay. The silence lasted long enough that it became something else, something deliberate. Then she said something to the guards, who left, said something to the engineers, who left. We were alone in the command room, except for a large guard near the entrance who was performing a convincing impression of a piece of furniture. She crossed to the lower platform beside the throne and sat on it, not the throne itself, which I would later understand was a significant distinction, and looked at me in the way you look at something you're trying to understand rather than something you've already classified. You are a strange thing, the translator said. I've heard that. The High Court will want you classified and transferred, she said. They have protocols for assets taken in conquest. It is efficient. Okay, I said. You are still not afraid. Still afraid, I said. But you didn't bring me here to classify me, or you'd have done it without this conversation. So I'm more interested in what you're going to say next. She studied me. Then, I am Vera. In your language, the closest translation is the scales. My mother named me for the concept of balance. The Bloodfang do not, as a cultural matter, value balance. They value force. My mother was considered eccentric. My name is Cal Rennick, I said. It doesn't mean anything. That secondary eyelid lowered both sides briefly. The Bloodfang equivalent of a held smile I would eventually learn. Sit, she said. There are more problems. The weeks that followed were the strangest arrangement I'd ever found myself in, and I've spent most of my adult life in arrangements that other people would find improbable. I had quarters, small, damp by human standards, the walls perpetually cool and slightly wet to the touch the way all Bloodfang interior spaces were. And I was not restrained beyond the escort of a guard named Doruk, who was enormous even by Bloodfang standards, and communicated primarily through variations in eyebrow positioning. I had access to the engineering section during working hours, I was fed. I was not harmed. I was also not free, which I was careful not to forget. But there is a version of captivity that is more honest than another, and Vera's version was honest. She had not asked me to pretend the situation was other than it was, and she had not pretended it herself. I was there because she had a use for what I knew how to do, and because she had enough authority for the moment to keep me where she decided to keep me. That was the truth of it. The work was real. That was also the truth. The Ashbourne Dominant had been in active campaign for 7 years, and 7 years of sustained military operations due to a ship. What sustained physical labor does to a body that isn't recovering properly. They accumulate damage. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow layered way of small things deferred. A seal that's starting to go. A coupling running at elevated temperature. A calibration that's drifted 2 degrees off center and nobody's noticed because the system still functions, just not quite as well as it should. I went through that ship the way I went through every installation that had been operated past its maintenance margins, methodically, without drama, starting at the most critical fault and working toward the ones that were serious but not yet urgent. The environmental system, which had been running through a filter pack that was 18 months past its replacement cycle. The navigation calibration, which had drifted enough that I found myself wondering how the pilots were compensating without knowing they were compensating. The power distribution grid, which I rebuilt from the secondary relays outward, because the primary relays were sound, but everything downstream of them had been installed with an understanding of power generation that didn't extend to power management, which are related disciplines but not identical. The water reclamation unit on Deck 7 I worked on for 3 days. It had been running at 60% capacity for what I estimated was at least 2 years, producing less clean water than the crew needed, and compensating through rationing that everyone had simply accepted as a permanent condition. I brought it to 93% using components I fabricated from parts that were technically decommissioned and sitting in a storage bay labeled, when I had it translated, as something like materials awaiting formal disposal. The formal disposal had apparently been pending for some time. When the water output increased, I heard about it from Doruk, who told me through his eyebrows and a brief set of translated words that the crew had noticed. He said this with the specific tone of someone reporting a development they consider more significant than they're acknowledging. Vera came to the engineering section in the evenings. After her command briefings, which apparently ran long and left her with a quality of controlled fatigue she permitted no one else to observe, she would appear in the doorway of whatever section I was working in and watch. She didn't pretend she wasn't watching. She watched the way she did everything, directly, without performance, with the specific quality of attention that has a purpose behind it. She asked questions. Not conversational questions. Not questions designed to put me at ease or to establish rapport. Precise, targeted questions from someone who was trying to understand a system and had identified the gaps in their understanding. "Why do you test twice?" she asked one evening, watching me run a diagnostic cycle on a secondary ventilation assembly. "Once to find the fault," I said. "Once to confirm that what I did actually fixed the fault instead of just suppressing the symptom. Our engineers test once. Then your engineers have probably fixed some things that broke again shortly after and concluded they were unlucky, when actually they'd solved the symptom and left the cause in place." A pause during which I kept working and she kept watching. Then, yes. She asked about Kessel 7, about the work I'd done there before everything changed. Not as sympathy, she wasn't performing sympathy and I didn't need it, but because she was building a picture of how human engineering worked from the ground up, and a thermal exchange rig on a resource-limited mining colony was a reasonable illustration of the fundamental approach. You have less than you need, you have no one to consult, and the problem needs solving regardless. What you develop from that situation is an improvisational precision that looks, from the outside, like either genius or stubbornness, and is actually neither. It's just what happens when the alternative is unacceptable. You design solutions without receiving authorization, she said. There was no one to authorize anything. I just figured out what needed doing. Among the Bloodfang, she said, acting without authorization from your commander is a serious failure of discipline. Among humans, I said, it depends entirely on whether it works. If it works, it's called initiative. The secondary eyelid again briefly. She was quiet for a moment. Then, my mother said something like that. She said that a warrior who requires permission for every decision is not a warrior. She is a weapon waiting to be aimed. She believed the distinction was important. It is, I said. The court considered it one of her more regrettable eccentricities. The court sounds like it has a vested interest in people waiting to be aimed, I said. She didn't answer that, but she didn't correct it either. The High Court's message arrived before I'd completed 3 months on the Ashbourne Dominant. I knew something had changed before I was told. The ship has moods, the way any large inhabited structure has moods, and the mood that day was tighter than usual. Doric's eyebrows were doing something they didn't usually do. The engineering staff I'd been working alongside, in the careful, technically mediated collaboration we developed, were quieter than their default setting. Vera told me in the evening, in the engineering section without preamble. The High Court has ruled, she said. You are to be classified as an imperial technical asset. Your knowledge of both human and Bloodfang systems makes you what they are calling a dual competence resource. The translator worked on the next part. You are to be transferred to Gorath Station and assigned to the shipyards. I knew of Gorath Station the way you know of places that exist at the intersection of utility and misery. What do you want to do? I asked. She looked at me. That is not how command authority works within the Empire. The High Court does not request my preference. I know, I said. I asked anyway. The silence that followed was different from the silences I'd learned to read from her, longer, and with a different quality. She was not waiting for me to fill it. She was using it. I want to refuse them, she said. I kept working. She watched. There is a word in Bloodfang, she said. That doesn't translate well. The closest your language comes is something like voluntary determination, the action that comes from what is inside you, not from what is commanded from above. The court considers this word, when applied to decisions that contradict their authority, to be a synonym for weakness. She paused. I do not agree with that definition. What happens if you refuse? A formal challenge to my command authority, a hearing. My mother's name will be raised. People who have been waiting for me to demonstrate her eccentricities will say that I have demonstrated them. Another pause, and then they will watch to see if I break. Will you? She looked at me for a long time. The engineering section was lit with the amber safety lighting I'd started to prefer for fine work, easier on the eyes over long hours, and it didn't wash out the color variations in the components I was examining. In that light, her armor was not black but deep violet, the color of a bruise at the stage where it's healing rather than fresh. Her eyes were the exact amber of the light source, which was a coincidence that had stopped feeling like a coincidence some time ago. No, she said. The representative from the High Court arrived 8 days after Vera sent her refusal. His ship docked with the efficiency of authority that doesn't expect to be kept waiting. His name translated as High Arbiter Chorath, and he was older than any Bloodfang I'd yet encountered. His shoulder armor worn smooth at the edges where years of use had polished it. His eyes the flat gray-green of deep still water. He moved through the Ashbourne Dominant with the deliberate slowness of a man who had long since stopped needing to hurry, because rank had made hurrying a thing that happened to other people. I watched his arrival from a corridor junction above the docking bay. Doric stood next to me and had decided I was staying near engineering, which I agreed with. But the Ashbourne Dominant's internal audio system was, as I discovered during my ventilation work, poorly compartmentalized, a deferred maintenance issue from a refit some years ago, where the sound insulation between sections hadn't been properly sealed, which meant that in certain areas of the ship, the command room was audible. I stood in one of those areas and listened. Chorath's voice was what I'd expected from his movement, deliberate, measured, each word placed with the care of a man who understood what words weighed. The translator gave me fragments. The human is a resource of the Empire and has been formally classified as such. The appropriate disposition is not discretionary at the level of individual commanders. Queen Vera's sentiment represents an imbalance in the proper ordering of things. That word, imbalance, her name, which meant the scales, which meant balance. He had chosen that word knowing exactly what it weighed. Then Vera's voice, even as a recording passed through a translator working at partial capacity, it had the quality I'd come to recognize as hers, steady, precise, without the performance of steadiness that people use when they are actually uncertain. "He is not a prisoner of this ship," she said. "He was taken in conquest," Chorath said. "Classification as a prisoner is not discretionary." "He is here because I have asked him to remain," Vera said, "and because he has agreed to remain. I did not use a word other than his name when I asked." I hadn't been explicitly asked, but thinking about it in that corridor, with Doruk next to me and the muffled voice of a high court arbiter making arguments about what I was, I realized she was right. She had never called me a prisoner to my face. She had never given me an order to remain. I had remained because there was work, and because leaving felt wrong in a way that wasn't strategic. It was just wrong. The way leaving a repair half-finished is wrong. The way walking away from a system that's still failing is wrong. Chorath said things about tradition, about what it meant for a Bloodfang commander to be seen as someone who permitted sentiment to override protocol, about the correct ordering of conquest and classification, and the management of resources. Then Vera said the thing that the translator worked on for longer than usual, and gave me in a version that caught most of the meaning, if not all of the weight. "He is not my prisoner. He is not my resource. He is not something I hold for the Empire's convenience. He is my choice. I made that choice from what is within me, not from what is commanded from above. If you call that imbalance, then you have told me what you think of the word my mother gave me. I suggest you think carefully about what I will do with that information." The silence after that lasted long enough that Doruk, next to me, made a sound I'd learned to recognize as the Bloodfang equivalent of someone quietly revising their expectations. The formal hearing was aboard Chorath's ship, in a chamber designed the way institutional spaces are always designed, to make you aware of how small you are relative to the institution. Hard angles, high ceilings, materials that were expensive enough to declare status without being decorative enough to invite comfort. The kind of room built to produce the right outcome, not to find it. Vera was permitted 4 attendants. She brought Doruk, 2 senior officers from the Ashbourne Dominant, and me. I had been told, through Doruk's eyebrows and the translator, that I was not expected to speak. I sat on a bench that was the wrong height for a human body and listened to 2 hours of Bloodfang argument in a language I was catching about 70% of, and thought about engineering. The thing about a 2-hour argument in a formal institutional setting is that it almost never contains new information after the first 20 minutes. The positions are established, the logic is laid out, and then the argument is about which position has more weight, political weight, traditional weight, the weight of whoever in the room has the most authority. This is not how you solve an engineering problem. In engineering, the problem doesn't care about political weight. The crack is the crack. The fault is the fault. What you need is an accurate understanding of what's actually happening, and then a solution that addresses the actual cause. Chorath's argument was what I'd expected, Tradition, proper classification, the risk of permitting sentiment to be mistaken for strategy, the danger of an imperial commander appearing to have been influenced by a resource rather than the other way around. He used the word sentiment, the way a skilled rhetorician uses a word, repeatedly, deliberately, so that by the end of 2 hours it would feel less like a description and more like a verdict. Vera's argument surprised me. I had expected her to argue against the framework. Instead, she argued from inside it, which is harder to do and more effective when it works. The Bloodfang Empire is powerful, she said, or the translator gave me this approximation, because we are not sentimental about value. We take what we find and extract from it what it is worth. The question before this hearing is not whether I have acted from sentiment. The question is whether I have assessed value correctly. She let that land, then. Gorath Station would use this human for his hands and his stamina. He would repair what he is directed to repair, under supervision, on systems selected by administrators who do not know what they don't know. I use him for his understanding, his ability to look at a fault and derive its cause rather than mask its symptom. His knowledge of engineering approaches that are not in our technical libraries, and that have produced results our engineers were unable to achieve. A pause. She had a talent for the loaded pause. I was starting to understand that this was not rhetorical skill so much as genuine conviction. She paused because she was making sure the next thing was true before she said it. In 60 days aboard this vessel, this human identified and corrected 19 mechanical faults, including a primary power relay failure our engineers had been unable to resolve, a water reclamation system running at 60% of design capacity, and a navigation calibration drift that would have compounded over the following 6 months into a serious operational hazard. Not because he was ordered to. Because he looked at things and understood them and fixed them. That is not a quality you transfer to a shipyard and assign to manual tasks. That is a quality you keep close and use at the level it operates. Choreth was not a man who gave ground visibly. But the hearing had its own logic, and the logic was cumulative, and the argument from value, not from sentiment, not from anything the court could dismiss as an eccentric queen's weakness, but from the cold assessment of what a thing was actually worth, was harder to counter than an emotional position would have been. The court gave Vera provisional authority over my status, pending a review in 90 days. Choreth looked at me once on his way out of the chamber, those flat gray-green eyes doing their own filing. I looked back. Vera passing me in the corridor outside. Now we have 90 days. To do what? I asked. To make the answer so obvious, she said, that the review is a formality. We had 63 days before the review was moved forward. I know the number because I counted. Old habit. In mining colonies, you track resources including time because all of them are finite, and the ones you don't track are the ones that run out on you. In 63 days, I did the work. Not to persuade anyone. Not to make a point to a high court or an arbiter with flat gray eyes. The work doesn't operate that way, or rather, the work operates the same way whether anyone is watching or not, and the result of the work is the same either way. You fix the thing correctly or you don't fix it. The audience has no part in that. The secondary cooling system on Deck 12 I found during a routine check of the power distribution subsystems. It had a design flaw, not in the cooling mechanism itself, but in the sensor array that was supposed to tell the main system when to engage it. The sensor array had a calibration problem that had been present, as far as I could tell, since the system was originally installed. Which meant the cooling had been engaging either too early or too late for the entire operational life of that section. And the equipment it was protecting had been running slightly hotter than it should have been for years, and the cumulative thermal stress was visible in the microfracture pattern on several of the primary components. I redesigned the sensor calibration. I explained what I was doing to the Bloodfang engineer assigned to work with me. A quiet, careful individual named something I'd learned to approximate as Reth, who had started our working relationship with visible skepticism and progressed through it to something closer to reluctant professional respect. I showed Reth why the original calibration was wrong, and how the thermal stress pattern in the components was the evidence, and why the fix needed to address the root cause rather than the symptom. Reth watched me work. Reth asked questions. The questions got better over 63 days. I told Vera about this in the evening, after the work was done. She listened in the way she listened to things she was going to think about for a long time after. Reth is learning to look for causes, she said. Yes. This is not how Bloodfang engineers are trained. I know, I said, but Reth is a good engineer who was working from incomplete principles. Give someone the right principles and the good engineer takes care of itself. She was quiet for a moment. My mother said something similar about command. She said that most commanders who fail do not fail from lack of ability. They fail because they were taught the wrong things about what ability means. I said, what did she teach you? Vera looked at the viewport, the one I'd cleaned early in my time on the ship, because a dirty observation window in a command space is a maintenance problem, and also just a diminishment of something that should be useful. The stars were very clear in it. She taught me that the scales don't lie, she said. That if you put a thing on one side and the truth on the other, the scales will always show you which is heavier, and your job is not to argue with the reading. Your job is to act on it. And what does the scale say now? I asked. She looked at me, the amber eyes steady. That I made the right choice, she said. And that the court knows it, even if they cannot say so yet. On the 63rd day, Choreth came back. His ship docked at midday. I was in the engineering section doing something that probably looked, to anyone watching, like very focused work on a pressure coupling junction, but was actually me paying close attention to every sound the ship was making while I worked with my hands. The ship had sounds. You learn them the way you learn anything, by listening consistently until the baseline is clear and the deviations become obvious. Today's deviation was in the crew's movement patterns, more traffic through certain corridors, a different quality to the communication signals I could hear through the ship's poorly compartmentalized internal audio. The posture of purpose rather than routine. Doruk appeared in the engineering section doorway. His eyebrows said something I'd learned to read as, "We should go." I set down the coupling junction. "Is she all right?" I asked. Doruk considered this for a moment with his eyebrows, then conveyed, "She is herself." That was enough. Choreth had taken the command room again, in the way he did things, not aggressively, just with the absolute confidence of a man who assumed the spaces he walked into were his to occupy. He was standing at the central platform, not the throne and not the lower platform where Vera sat when it was just the two of us, but in the middle of the room's geometry, which was a statement about position rather than preference. Vera was at the viewscreen bank. She looked at me when I came in briefly, with nothing in her face that needed to be hidden. Choreth said, "The review has been moved forward." Vera said nothing. She had learned, in some negotiation I hadn't witnessed, when to let silence be the response. The High Court has reviewed Queen Vera's documentation of this vessel's operational improvements over the period in question. He said this with the flat, administrative weight of a verdict being read into a record. They find the argument substantive. He looked at me directly, the gray-green eyes. "The Bloodfang Empire does not revise its rulings," he said. "We update our assessments when new evidence demonstrates that a previous assessment was incomplete. There is a difference." "All right," I said. "The classification of Cal Rennick as a conquered resource is withdrawn," Choreth said. "Queen Vera has proposed an alternative classification. The court has accepted it with conditions." He looked at Vera. She said something in Bloodfang, the translator worked on it and gave me, ally of the Ashborn dominant, retained by choice, present by will. The condition, Chorath said, is that the classification reflects reality, that the word choice is accurate, that the human remains not from constraint or incapacity but from his own determination. He looked at me. Human, do you remain on this vessel by your own will, not from any inability to leave, not from any order given to you, by your own decision? I looked at Vera. She was watching me with the even, honest attention she gave to everything she was genuinely uncertain about, and I realized she was genuinely uncertain. She had not assumed my answer. She had made her argument to the court based on what she believed was true, but she had not made me promise it was true, because that wasn't the kind of thing she did. She waited for the scale to show her what was heavier. I thought about Kessel 7, about a thermal exchange rig I'd fixed properly that was probably still running, about a power relay on this ship that hadn't failed in 2 months, about a water reclamation unit on Deck 7 that was producing clean water for a crew that had been rationing it for years and had stopped noticing that they were rationing it. I thought about Reth asking better questions. I thought about the word my mother had used for what she did, not repair, not maintenance, but keeping things whole. Her word for it, the vocation of making things last. I thought about the scales. Yes, I said, I'm here because I chose to be. Chorath was quiet for a moment that stretched into several. Then he looked at Vera and said something that the translator gave me very carefully as, "Your mother named you accurately." He left with his people, the door closed, the command room was quiet. Vera and I were alone, with Doruk at the entrance being the wall he was so good at being. She looked at me for a long moment. I didn't say anything. I'd learned that she didn't need things filled in. Then she said quietly, "There will be more problems." "Yes," I said. "The court will watch. This will be called a precedent by some and an error by others, and both of them will be waiting to see which it turns out to be." "It will be a precedent," I said, "because the ship works better than it did, and that's not going to change back." She looked at me. The secondary eyelid fully lowered, both sides sustained, the fullest version of the expression I'd seen from her. Not quite a smile by any standard I could claim to fully understand. Something that had the function of a smile. Something that meant, yes, that's the right weight. "Go fix something," she said. I went back to the engineering section. The pressure coupling junction I'd left was still waiting. I picked it up. I worked on it with the lights at the amber setting I'd come to prefer, and Doruk stood at the doorway, and somewhere in the ship Reth was probably looking at something, and trying to find the cause rather than the symptom, and the water reclamation unit was running at 93%, and the ventilation was running at the efficiency it was supposed to run at, and the power relay had been humming at the correct register for 63 days. Things were working the way they were supposed to work. Not because anyone had watched, or because a high court had been persuaded, or because a political argument had been won. Because the faults had been found and understood and addressed at their source rather than masked, and because that was the work, and the work was the thing, and the rest of it, the hearings, the arguments, the words like prisoner and resource and ally and choice, those were the things that happened around the work. The work itself was simple. Find what's broken, understand why it's broken, fix it in a way that lasts. Test it twice. Outside the viewport I'd cleaned on my second day aboard, the stars did what they always did. They stayed where they were, in their arrangement, doing their thing. The same stars that hung over Kessel 7. The same stars that hung over every colony and every world with people in it who were looking at broken things and deciding to understand them. I tightened the coupling. It seated correctly. I ran the diagnostic. The reading was clean. I ran it again. Still clean. That was all. That was enough. The thing was fixed and it would stay fixed, and it would do its job quietly without announcing itself, and no one would notice it, and that was exactly right. That was what fixed meant. I set down my tools and sat with the clean diagnostic reading for a moment, the way you sit with a thing when it's done correctly. Not with pride, exactly. Just with the specific, quiet satisfaction of a system in balance. Then I picked up the tools again, because there is always the next thing. There is always something else that needs understanding, something else that needs keeping whole. That's not a complaint. That's the job. That's what we do. 3 weeks after the review, Vera asked me something she'd been working toward for a while. I could tell she'd been working toward it the way you can tell a structure has been under load before it shows the stress. Something in the deliberateness of her approach, the way she'd been building a vocabulary for a conversation she hadn't had yet. She appeared in the engineering section one evening, as she usually did, but instead of watching the work for a few minutes before asking something precise about the methodology, she sat down on a supply crate across from where I was working and looked at me in the way she looked at things she was about to commit to. "Tell me about the first thing you ever fixed," she said. I set down what I was holding. This wasn't a systems question. This was something else. "Water pump," I said. "My mother's workshop on Helen Station. I was 9. The pump was supposed to move water from the recycling tank to the fabrication unit, and it had stopped. My mother was in the middle of a job and couldn't leave it, so she told me to look at the pump and see if I could figure out what was wrong." "Did you?" "Took me about 2 hours. The impeller had a worn bearing, the rotation was slightly off-center, and it was rubbing against the housing instead of spinning freely. There was no replacement bearing available, so I made one. Lathe work was basic, but I'd been watching my mother for years. The pump ran for another 6 months before we could get a proper part." Vera was quiet for a moment. "How did you know what to look for?" "I didn't," I said. "I took the pump apart and looked at all the pieces and thought about what each piece was supposed to do, and then I found the one that wasn't doing its job." "You knew what each piece was supposed to do?" "By then, yes. I'd been watching machines for as long as I could remember. My mother thought understanding how things worked was more important than any other kind of education. She said if you understood how things worked, you could figure out everything else from first principles." Vera considered this. "My mother said something similar. She said that a general who understood why their warriors fought was more powerful than a general who understood only how to deploy them. Knowing the mechanism versus knowing the meaning." "Your mother was an engineer," I said. She looked at me. "She was a commander." "Same thing," I said. "A person who understands the systems they're responsible for well enough to know what's actually happening versus what appears to be happening. That's engineering. Doesn't matter if the system is mechanical or military." The secondary eyelid lowered briefly. "She would have found that comparison either insulting or deeply flattering," Vera said. "I think deeply flattering. She respected people who understood things." "What did she not respect?" I asked. "People who performed understanding," Vera said immediately. "People who learned to say the right things without learning to see the right things." She said the empire was full of them, and that most of them eventually reached positions of authority because they were very skilled at performing understanding for other people who were also performing it, and no one ever looked at the actual results closely enough to notice that nothing was working. I thought about Choreth. I didn't say anything about Choreth. "Was she right?" I asked. "About most things," Vera said, "including the ones that made her unpopular." I had been on the Ashbourne Dominant for 4 months when we received news that changed the shape of the immediate future. The campaign that the fleet had been prosecuting for 7 years. The slow, systematic expansion into a cluster of resource-rich systems that the Bloodfang called the Veth territories had reached a phase requiring different assets than the Ashbourne Dominant carried. Vera's fleet was being redirected. The new assignment was an extended survey and stabilization operation in a region called the Orth Margin. Lightly populated, strategically important for energy infrastructure access, recently brought under preliminary Bloodfang control, but not yet fully integrated. I heard the word energy infrastructure in the briefing. Vera had begun including me in certain operational discussions, with Doruk present and the translator running, as part of the argument she was continuing to make about practical value, and something in my chest did a particular thing. The Orth Margin infrastructure, I said. What kind? Solar collection arrays, Vera said, in orbit around 3 systems. They were operational under the previous administration and are currently. The translator worked on the next word. Unstable. How unstable? She looked at me. In the assessment our engineers produced, they determined that 2 of the 3 arrays will fail within 18 months if not addressed. What does fail mean in this context? I asked. Loss of power output, structural degradation, ultimately collapse of the orbital component. I was quiet for a moment. 3 solar collection arrays, power infrastructure for a region of space. The kind of systems that when they worked, nobody thought about, and when they failed, everything downstream failed with them. I can fix solar collection arrays, I said. Vera looked at me with the amber eyes and the steadiness. I know, she said. That's why we're going there, I said, not a question. She didn't confirm it, she didn't need to. The scales don't lie. The Orth Margin was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are operating correctly. 3 star systems, each with its own pale light, each with a collection array in a high stable orbit that had been designed, I was relieved to find, by engineers who had understood what they were building. The design was elegant, a floating lattice of collectors oriented to maximize exposure, each one balanced against the gravitational gradient in a way that distributed load across the whole structure rather than concentrating it at junctions. Someone had thought carefully about this. Someone had also not maintained it for approximately 4 years. 4 years of micrometeorite impacts, of thermal cycling stress, of the slow degradation that happens to any unattended structure operating in a dynamic environment. The arrays were not collapsed. They were tired. The distinction matters. A collapsed structure is a different problem from a tired one. A tired structure is one that has been pushed past its maintenance margins and needs someone to listen to what it's been trying to say. I spent the first week in a pressure suit outside the second array, running my hands along the collector struts and looking at the stress patterns in the material. Doruk floated next to me, tethered to the inspection shuttle, watching me with an eyebrow expression that I interpreted as thoughtful concern about whether I knew what I was doing. He had expressed this concern about a lot of things I'd done over the past 4 months. I had so far given him no reason to act on it. The Bloodfang engineers who came with us, a team of 8 including Reth, who had specifically requested the assignment, worked alongside me. Not the way they'd worked at the beginning, with the skepticism of people watching an outsider attempt something they didn't trust. The way they worked now, which was the way that people work when they've been taught to look for causes rather than symptoms, and have discovered that it produces better results. With genuine engagement, with questions that were getting better, with the willingness to say when something they were looking at didn't match the model they had for how it should behave. I taught them the diagnostic patterns, the way a stress fracture propagates differently from a material fatigue failure. The difference between a junction that has failed and a junction that is about to fail, which is a distinction that matters very much when you're making decisions about which sections of an array can bear load during repair operations, and which ones need to be isolated first. Reth, floating beside me on the 3rd day, pointed at a section of strut material that I hadn't flagged yet, and said something through the communication system that the translator gave me as, "This one is going to fail. The discoloration here, it's the same pattern as the section we isolated yesterday." I looked at where Reth was pointing. Reth was right. Yes, I said, flag it. Reth flagged it, and in the notes recorded the observation and the reasoning, the way I'd been demonstrating for weeks. Not just why. I said nothing else about it that evening. But that night, floating in the berth I'd been assigned in the survey vessel we were operating from, I thought about what it meant that Reth had seen it. That the pattern recognition I'd been trying to build in those working sessions had taken hold to the point where it was operating independently, looking at new information through the framework we'd developed together. My mother had called it multiplication. The thing that happens when you teach something correctly, not the technique but the understanding behind the technique, and it starts producing results that no single person could produce alone. The first array took 6 weeks. The second took 4, because by then we had the patterns understood and the team working at a level of coordination that cut the analysis time substantially. The third array was in better shape than the first 2 and took 3 weeks. At the end of 13 weeks in the Orth margin, 3 solar collection arrays that had been on a trajectory toward structural failure were producing clean, stable power output at 91% of designed capacity, which was better than they'd been doing at any point in the previous 4 years. Vera held a briefing after the final assessment came in. I sat at the edge of the briefing space with the translator and listened to her present the operational results to her senior staff, and then to a secured communication channel that I understood was being monitored by the High Court. She said the numbers. She said them flatly without elaboration, the way Vera said everything that was true and important. Here is what the scales show. Here is the weight. Then she said, these results were produced by this team operating from principles they were not trained in, applied to systems they had not previously worked with, in conditions that included significant environmental variables. She paused. The methodology transferred, the understanding transferred. That is the substantive finding. After the briefing, Chorath's voice came through the communication channel. He said one thing. The translator gave it to me as, noted. That was all. That was enough. On the last evening before we left the Orth margin, I floated in the observation deck of the survey vessel and looked at the second array from the outside. It looked different than it had 13 weeks ago. Not visually different, the structure was the same structure, in the same orbit, doing the same thing it had been doing before. But I knew it differently. I knew which sections had been replaced and which had been reinforced and which had simply needed to be listened to. I knew the stress patterns and the repair history, and the specific junction on the north-facing collector bank that had given me the most trouble and had ultimately required a solution I'd never used before and would use again. The array didn't know any of this. Arrays don't know things. They just work or they don't work, and the people who maintain them carry the history. I thought about what Vera had said on our first real conversation, that her name meant the scales, and that the scales don't lie, that your job is to act on what the scales show you. The array was in balance. It would stay in balance if someone listened to it, and I had spent 13 weeks making sure that someone could. That the knowledge wasn't in one person, stored in one head, dependent on one person staying in one place. It was distributed now, in 8 engineers who understood not just how to fix these specific arrays, but how to look at systems they'd never seen before and find the fault and understand the fault, and address the fault at its source. My mother would have called that the whole point. I thought yes. We left the Orth margin on a morning that looked, through the observation deck viewport, like most mornings in that part of space. The 3 pale stars at their usual angles, the arrays in their orbits, the power flowing steadily through the microwave transmission systems to the worlds below. Everything as it should be, nothing announcing itself. Vera found me in the engineering section an hour after departure, which was where she always found me, and which I realized she'd come to rely on. That I would be there, doing the work, and that she could think out loud in that space the way she couldn't in the command room or the briefing spaces. "The court has sent a formal update," she said. "What does it say?" I asked. "It says that the provisional classification is confirmed. No further review scheduled." I kept working. "They also added language," she said, "about the Orth margin results and what they indicate about certain types of resource assessment. The type where you look at what something can actually do rather than what category it fits," I said. "Yes." "Progress," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then Choreth added a personal note. It said that my mother's approach to command had produced a result he had not anticipated and that he was updating his assessment. She paused. "That is the closest to an apology that Choreth is capable of producing." "I know," I said. I could tell from how precise the language was. The secondary eyelid, both sides sustained. "You're learning to read us," she said. "I've been learning to read systems my whole life," I said. "People are systems. The principles are the same." She sat down on the equipment crate, her usual position when it was just the two of us in the engineering section, and for a moment was just quiet with the hum of the ship doing its work around us. The coupling junctions I'd replaced over the past 4 months. The ventilation running at its correct efficiency. The power relay that had been humming at the right register for 5 months now without a flicker. "What happens," she said, "if this works?" "The ship keeps running," I said. "The engineers you have now can pass what they learn to the next set of engineers. The arrays in the Orth margin stay operational and the systems downstream of them stay powered. The principles get taught instead of the techniques, and the techniques improve because the principles are sound." I paused. "That's what happens when something is fixed correctly. It keeps working, and then it becomes the foundation for the next thing." "And to you," she said. "What happens to you?" I thought about Kessel 7, which was still occupied, and about 6 people I'd shared a metal room with. I thought about a home that was not this ship and a life that was not this one. I thought about the thermal exchange rig in the mine tunnel below the colony, running still, 40 meters underground, doing its job. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I know what I'm doing right now. I know that the work is real and the results are real. I know that there's more of it to do. That's usually enough." Vera looked at me for a long moment, the amber eyes steady and honest and not performing anything. "That is a very Bloodfang answer," she said. "Or a very human one," I said. She thought about this. "Perhaps they are the same answer," she said, "arrived at from different directions." "Maybe," I said. "That happens sometimes. 2 different ways of building something, and you look at the structure from outside, and the load-bearing principle is identical." She stood the way she did everything with the quality of decision behind it, nothing wasted. "I have a briefing," she said. "I have a coupling junction," I said. She left. I kept working. Doruk appeared in the doorway, resumed his wall position, and his eyebrows said something that I'd learned over these months to read as something close to, "This is working." I agreed with that. The evidence supported it. I tightened the junction. It seated cleanly. I ran the diagnostic. I ran it again. Clean. The ship moved through the dark between stars, carrying its crew and its history and its systems running the way they were supposed to run. And somewhere behind us 3 solar arrays orbited in their careful paths, holding their balance, doing their job, not asking for recognition. That's what fixed means. That's what lasts.